Welcome to day 119 of Bible 365 with me, Kathy Carter. I'm hosting it. Bible 365 means we're going through the Bible in 1 year, 365 days. And today we are on, I'm hoping this isn't mirrored, so we'll see. Today we are on day 119. It is April 28th, and we are reading 2 Samuel 15 through 17:14. And this is our reading for today. So we're in 2 Samuel, and this means we are with King David. We have been with King David for a few weeks at this point, but we're still learning about King David. Yesterday, we learned a few things about him. And one of the things that we learned was that he was going to be suffering calamity because he made some really big disasters against the Lord. Before we go into that, I am using the 1 Year Chronological Bible Study to do this reading. It is chronological, which means it goes from the beginning of time until Jesus rose and ascended in about 40 years, 40, 60, maybe 80 years after his rise. And so it's historical. And so what it does is it goes through it in time. It's not cover to cover, the Bible front to back, because there's a lot of places in between that could make it very, very confusing. The Bible is not lined up chronologically. It is lined up in an order, but it's not chronological. It's like major prophets, minor prophets, history, books of wisdom, the Torah, right? So and obviously I went ridiculously out of order, but that is how the Bible is lined up. It's lined up significantly differently than chronologically. So we are going chronologically or historically. It helps the reader, the listener, understand what is happening in time while it is happening. So then it helps me know who the reader is, and it helps me understand who the reader is, what they would understand, and then why that matters, and then who God is according to that reader, and then all the way through time, right? So it's really just a help. If you have read it through chronologically before, you probably understand why. If you have never read it through chronologically, I'm betting you're going to grow a lot in this year's reading. So using the 1 Year Chronological Bible Plan, which is at the 1 Year Chronological Bible online.com, you would download a free printable reading plan. And so then today you would be with me. And again, we're on April 28th. That's our day, 117. All right. So David is our king. David is the king of Israel. It is not the entire world. It is a very small piece of land, which is in current day Israel. At that time, it was Canaan, as well as a little bit of the Jordan, a little bit of Jordan, the country Jordan, a little bit of Syria, a little bit of Lebanon. So there are some surrounding areas that it took up as well. And this is it's all around the Jordan River. And this is all the 12 tribes of Israel. They are all united under King David. King David and King Saul were at war. God lifted up King David to be the king. And unfortunately, Saul passed away essentially by his own hand, first by the enemy, then by his own hand. And so this leaves David as king over all the people. There was celebrations, there was joy, there was excitement. And then it came the time that kings should be out at war, and David was not out at war. He was instead looking on a woman, deciding that he needed to have her, took her, even though she was someone else's wife. And then when she got pregnant, he killed her husband. And so he has sort of a multitude of sins sort of churning up within him. Nathan, the prophet at the time, called him out. He repented for those sins. Unfortunately, the punishment still is that there's going to be calamity on David's house, and that son would die. So after that, he took Bathsheba as his wife. She had more sons. He had many, 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 many sons, lots of daughters. And then one of his daughters was raped by one of his sons. And then the other son killed the one son, Amnon. So Amnon raped Tamar. Then Absalom killed Amnon and then took off and ran away. David was very sad that, of course, that his son had to go away. And then Joab concocted this scheme to get Absalom to come back. Absalom is now back in Israel. David has accepted him back sort of into the fold. He's now even in relationship with his father, David. And so we're going to go from here. So we're sort of moving on from this point. So reading in 2 Samuel 15, starting in verse 1. So here we go. It says, in the course of time, so Absalom's welcome back, and now some time is going by. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. So in other words, he has built up I don't want to say an army because it's certainly not an army, but he's kind of built up a regiment. Let's just put it that way. And what he's doing is just sort of painting a picture for you. So David lives in the city walls, and David responds to people who are having issues. So, what we learned from the woman, my son beat up my other son, and the one son died, or my lamb was taken by my neighbors and he's not paying me back, right? So, there are all these things that they go to David for. And it's usually more extreme things because David is obviously ultimately the king, and he's not some of the lower judges that are handling small misdemeanors. But so they would come, and when they would come, what they would come try and come inside the gates, but before they would get inside the gates, Absalom set himself up. So imagine like they're riding in, okay, this way, riding into town, and as they're riding into town to go see David, Absalom has sort of set himself up here. Absalom is David's son. I'm assuming, although again, I don't know for sure. I'm assuming that many of the people knew that Absalom was David's son, right? So they knew there was some power there, right? So he wasn't just a nobody sitting on the side of the road. He was pretty important. He had built up, like I said, a little regiment for himself. He had people around him. He had chariots. He had horses. And so, and the people would come up and they would say, he would say, where are you from? And they would say, I'm from this tribe. I'm from the tribe of Judah. And so he would say, remembering now that he's an Israelite, right? Because there were foreigners that came as well. But this guy, let's say, who comes up is an Israelite, and he said, oh, well, what's your issue? And so he says his issue, and they said, oh, David can't judge that. There's, the king can't judge that. There's too much going on in there. And so he can't be his judge. Let me see. He says, Absalom said, look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you. So there's nobody in there that's going to listen to you, but you've got a good argument, but there's no one in there that's going to hear you. However, if I was judge, I would bring you justice. And so each time, and he gets up early in the morning, right? So he goes there early in the morning before they can even reach David. So each time he slowly starts to build up all of these people thinking that he's going to be righteous. He was also, it says also when in verse 5, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, so again, recognizing that he was David's son, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. So, like, there's no difference between you and me. I'm one of the people. I'm one of you guys, right? So he's building a rapport with these people against David. So, and I want to be clear that I believe it's against David because he's saying, no one's going to go in there and hear you. But if I were in there, I would listen to you. So he's telling untruths about David. He's exaggerating about himself. Or maybe he thinks he's going to do this. And then he is sort of, a terrible term that I would use, but he's schmoozing the people, right? So he's building up how this Absalom is so great, right? So they would leave and go, oh, if only Absalom brought us justice. David can't bring us justice if only Absalom brought us justice. Oh, did you meet that Absalom? He was so kind. He was the king's son, and yet he hugged me and he kissed me. So he's slowly manipulating the people and building up his army. 4 years later, so he has been doing it. He is a patient man. He's been doing this for 4 years later. So at the end of this 4 years, he goes to his father and he says, King, listen, I made a vow when I was far away. I made a vow that I would go to Hebron and I would meet God there. So and we know how important the vows were to the Israelite people. If you have been with me in the past, you know that this making a vow is extremely important. You don't want to break a vow between yourself and God. This isn't just like, oh, I promise I'll do this, and then you don't do it, right? It's a vow between you and the Lord, and punishment would happen if you broke that vow. And so he tells David this. David says, sure, go ahead, go and take your vow. He doesn't go alone. So it says Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel. So essentially when he gets to Hebron, trumpets are going to sound. And when trumpets sound, you're going to say Absalom is king in Hebron. So he's going to go take over this area. 200 men from Jerusalem accompanied Absalom. They'd been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. So they just went with him because they were invited. Then Absalom offered sacrifices, and he also sent for Ahithophel, who is David's counselor. So again, it doesn't seem like, not sure, but doesn't seem like Ahithophel also knows what's happening. He's being sent for by the king's son, and so he goes with the king's son. And meanwhile, once they get there, trumpets are going to sound and everyone's going to shout out that Absalom is king. And so starting here, it says in verse 13, it says, a messenger came and tells David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. And then David says to his officials, so David then decides he's going to take off, right? So my son is kind of coming in and he's taken over. And he said, none of us are going to escape Absalom. Absalom's going to essentially come in and kill everyone. And they're going to bring ruin on us and put the city to sword. So he says, they're going to take him out and they're all going to leave. And then people want to go with him. So in verse 16, it says, the king set out with his entire household, except he leaves 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So these women, that not his wives, but these other women who he was with, but they were in relationship with him, but they weren't his wives. And so he's going to leave them there, but he's taking everybody else in the household. Hopefully it's in an assumption that that Absalom is not going to hurt them. He's going to leave them alone, but he's not going to destroy the house because it's just the concubines that are in there. So anyway, as he's leaving, it says in verse 18, all his men marched past him along with the Kerethites and Pelethites and all 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath. So all of these people now come out and they want to go and leave with David. So imagine David is leaving his place right inside the city, and he's marching away because Absalom is over in Hebron and he's going to be coming. And so he's going to leave. David and his entourage, so to speak, are going to leave. And as they're on their way out, all these people who love him are going to come and they're going to join him. And then what does he say? The king says, why would you come along with us? Not being rude. I'm sure I made a face that seemed rude. Why would you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You just got here. You don't owe me anything, so I don't want you to come with me. He's like, what am I going to make you wander when I don't even know where I'm going? He's just leaving. He's fleeing. He doesn't know where he's going to land. He says, go back and take your people with you. But then this king, this Ittai replies to King David, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king goes, whether it means life or death, there your servant will be. And then so David accepts them. Someone else later tries to come. But I want to make a point here. And this point actually goes back to David and Saul. So in some ways, this situation is sort of emulating the situation between David and Saul. Not that they're purposely emulating, but there's really similar circumstances, right? Saul had the main house. David was run off. So here's your first difference. David was run off, and then people started building up David's army. David's army got bigger, and Saul's army got smaller. And then we see sort of the reverse here. David's army, he's sort of running with a small faction, and then Absalom is building up his army. Saul was king. David ran away by himself, and people started joining David through no encouragement or coaxing or manipulation of David, right? So like, this isn't like, because I don't want anyone to think as they're reading this or listening to this, like, well, he did the same thing, and so he gets what he deserves kind of thing. It doesn't seem to be what it's about. What I want to remind you of what it's about is the calamity that God promised him because he had slept with Bathsheba, a wife that was not his own, and then killed her husband, right? So now calamity is coming on the house because of that. And so when Saul and David did this, everyone flocked to David. But now that Absalom and David are doing this, right? That's kind of the same thing. David is king. Absalom is trying to be king. Absalom did all this manipulating to get these people to follow him, even to the point where he lied. Actually, he lied to almost all of them, right? He treated them like they were equals, which I know sounds good, but that's not the way he meant it. He meant it just to get them to follow him. He lied and said David wasn't going to bring justice. He lied and made 200 people come over and follow him, even though they had no idea what they were following him for, right? So there is a difference. And then we even see here that David is still David, right? He has made some massive errors, but he is still David. And he says, listen, there's nothing good is going to come from you coming with me. So please just go back and kind of save yourselves and go be with Absalom. But they still won't do it. All right. So there's still something in David that people are drawn to and that people want to follow David as David being the leader. And again, Absalom manipulated his way into leadership. So then the Gittites come with him, the Pelethites come with him, the Kerethites come with him. And then it says in verse 23, the whole countryside wept aloud. So again, they're all passing by. So as this caravan of people is passing by and everyone knows they're leaving because Absalom is king, it says the whole countryside wept. And I just want to add in this little note because of how poetically I like to read things. I'm definitely not a black and white, right? Like I believe that the Bible is true. I believe it is 100% true. However, when I say I believe it's 100% true, there's some artistic language in a lot of the Bible. It doesn't make it untrue, right? It's just artistic language, just the way that we tell stories, right? It doesn't make the story untrue. We just add some really pretty words to it. So I think when it says the whole countryside is weeping, I'm thinking two things. One, it is countryside is not literal, right? It is that the people who live in this country are weeping, right? So there's, yes, they're going to follow Absalom because Absalom is king and they see that David is leaving, but it's a devastating blow to Israel, right? David has brought them peace. David has taken the Philistines out of the land, right? He has won war after war, battle after battle for them. And again, he's brought them all together. He's danced at the ark of God. He's brought the ark back into Israel. So he has done all of these amazing things. And so they're weeping. They're broken, right? The people in some ways are broken that he's leaving and they're watching him leave. In the other way, that is maybe more literal, is I believe the actual countryside is weeping. And so I see this language happening in Genesis. And so if you've been with me from Genesis, you might recall some of these things. When Abel or Cain killed Abel, the land cried out to the Lord. His blood cried out to the Lord, right? And so I think it's very literal because God made all of those things. When I know there was another example. Oh, Sodom and Gomorrah. The land cried out because of all the violence that was happening in that area. And again, we could assume it was the people. I don't want to take anything away from that. But God made everything. This whole world works in unity with each other. We wouldn't survive without the oxygen that the trees provide, right? Without the water that the oceans provide. Oceans, lakes, rivers. Obviously, oceans are salt, but oceans, lakes, and rivers, right? That the water that is provided by the clouds, right? So the whole earth works together connectedly, and God made all of it, and it all worships God. And so, in some ways, seeing David leave, right? Someone that God anointed very particularly, God put there, and he's been reigning there for a long time, and he loves the Lord. David loves the Lord and honors the Lord and sings about the Lord and dances to the Lord. And I think in some ways that broke the land a little bit. And so that's what I see when I look at that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But I do see a visual of the country, really, the countryside, right? The earth itself loving David as a leader. All right, so I want to move on because running out of time. So in verse 24, another group of people wants to join David. So this is Zadok and the priests. And so they want to join David and they bring the ark of God with them. Remember that the ark is where God speaks to the high priest, right? So I'm sure it's covered, but they want to carry it with them and take it to David. And David doesn't allow this. He doesn't want the ark of God to leave Israel. So he says, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor, and here we go again with David, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. So if God chooses to let me back in, he will allow me to see the Ark of the Covenant, right? He will allow me to see his dwelling place once again, right? He will honor me and bestow me with the gift of seeing his house. But he says, if God says, I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. This is one of those moments where David is not trying to fight back in his own will. David is accepting exactly what he believes God is giving to him. So he remembers the prophecy. I'm going to say that. It doesn't say, oh, David remembers the prophecy. I'm taking contextually that he remembers the prophecy and he recognizes that this was going to happen and it is now happening. There is now calamity in his house and he is running away and he's allowing God to work this out in the way that God works this out. This is very similar to the way he worked out his situation with Saul, right? He had an opportunity twice to kill Saul, and he did, King Saul, who was chasing him, and he didn't. He chose not to. He chose to allow the Lord to do what the Lord was going to do. If the Lord wanted him to be king and he anointed him to be king, the Lord would put him where he belongs. All right. So then it says, so then he says, "Do you understand? Go back." And then he says, "I will wait. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So then they took the ark back, right? So then they faithfully took the ark back where it belonged. And then David goes up, continues up to the Mount of Olives. He's crying. He's covered with ashes, right? His head is bare. He's barefoot. Or I'm sorry, his head is covered and he's barefoot. And it says, "Now David had been told in verse 31, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." This is one of his counselors. And then David prays to the Lord and he says, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." David did not pray for death. He did not pray for him being saved. He prayed for the counsel to be turned to foolishness. And so maybe that he wouldn't succeed as king. So I just find it to be an interesting prayer, something for us to look at in the way that we pray for our enemies as well, right? So how do we pray? Do we pray that we just want them to get into a car accident? I don't know. Like some of the things that we pray sometimes aren't great, right? Like you think to yourself, oh, I'm not going to be that bad, but I really hate this person. And so how are we praying when we have been sinned against, right? He's definitely been sinned against. So when David arrives at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai, another one of his people, his robe was torn and his dust was on his head. And then David says, "I don't want you to come with me. I want you to go." And he says, "I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice." So he's saying, I want you to go in there and I kind of want you to mess with everything a little bit. Like whatever he says, I want you to kind of mess with that advice a little bit that he's getting from Ahithophel. Then he wants him to get that information, right? He's going to do that. And then he's going to pass the information down through a handful of people who are then going to bring that information back to David. So he's going to be a spy. All right, so now we're moving on to a slightly different section. This is sort of like in between. So in verse 1 of Samuel 16, it says, when David had gone a short distance, so he's still going a short distance, he sees Ziba. If you guys remember who Ziba is, he is the servant of Mephibosheth, who is Jonathan's son, Saul's son. So Saul, Jonathan, Mephibosheth. David has been taking care of Mephibosheth, and he left sort of everything in the care of Ziba and all the servants in that area. But Ziba comes up with a whole bunch of food and all the stuff that he's giving to David, food, wine, all these things to feed them. And then the king asks, "What have you brought these for?" And then Ziba answers, "It's for the king's household to ride on, for things for the men to eat, to refresh them when they get exhausted." And then he says, "Where is your master's grandson?" So where's Mephibosheth? Ziba replies, he's staying in Jerusalem. He thinks today the Israelites will restore to him his grandfather's kingdom. So he stayed there because he believes the kingdom is now going to come to him. And then so David takes all of the stuff that he promised Mephibosheth and he gives it to Ziba and all of his family. And so obviously Ziba is happy and he says, "I bow to you and may I find favor in your eyes." So then he keeps moving. And while he's still moving, he's approaching Bahurim, a man from the same clan as the same clan as Saul, which is the tribe of Benjamin. His family comes out. And once he comes out, they start throwing stones at David and all of his people. And they are then also calling him a murderer. So they're crying out to him. And his first man in charge, David's first man in charge, was like, "Let me go and let me kill this guy because he shouldn't be throwing stones at you." And then David says something we'd probably consider surprising. So in verse 10, the king says, "What does this have to do with you?" His head command. "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" So he's basically saying, don't go against the Lord. There is a possibility that this guy is out here cursing me because God put it on his heart to do so. And again, we go back to the prophecy. Calamity is going to come down on David. So then then he follows up with, he says, verse 11, it says, David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be, so this is the second point, it may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me to his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So he realizes that this is cursing. He's being cursed. And he's saying, if I let this go and I don't do anything about it, and the Lord sees how miserable I am, then maybe he will restore his blessing to me. So he's willing to accept this punishment, believing that this is from the Lord, with the possibility of getting back in the good graces of the Lord. So getting the Lord's blessings again. So again, this is just something I feel like honoring of God. He's even accepting a punishment that most of us would try and fight our way out of. Most of us would not just accept it and say, well, I'm sure I'm going to learn something from this. Or actually, he doesn't even say that. So he says, maybe the Lord will accept me because I'm upset. So he doesn't even say like, oh, I learned this, I learned that. Like he just accepts what the Lord gave him. And so it's a recognition for me to think about what it is I'm trying to fight in my own strength without allowing the Lord to deal with those things. All right, so meanwhile, let's go to Absalom now. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem. This is verse 2 Samuel 16:15. Came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And then Hushai came as well. And he's like, aren't you Hushai? Aren't you David's man? And he's like, no, long live the king. I'm going to follow you. So now he's got David's two counselors in front of him. And he's like, okay, guys, what do I do next? And Ahithophel recommends that he goes and sleeps with David's concubines. So King David's concubines. So he goes to, and he says, you do this, everyone's going to follow you after that. You're going to do it publicly, and then everyone's going to follow you after that. And so he does, and he does do it publicly. Again, now we see that this is the prophecy that was given to Daniel way back with Nathan. So we can see now this prophecy has been fulfilled, and his son Absalom has done this. And this is years later. We know it's probably because it's probably in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 years after the prophecy was made. And so he goes out, he sleeps with them, and then it follows up in verse 21. Sorry, that's where he says sleep with him. And then he sleeps with them on the roof. And now it follows up in verse 23. Now, in those days, the advice of Ahithophel, the advice that he gave, was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of his advice. So they assumed, and they assumed that this was advice from God. So, which would make sense because this is the prophecy coming true. And he's just following the king at this point. So verse 17:1, Ahithophel says to Absalom, now he's doing like the second part of this. I would choose 12,000 men, set out tonight in pursuit of David, attack them while they're weak. So they're weak, they're weeping, they're sad, they're going out, they don't have that many people with them. Now's the time, make your move, go to them, kill just the king, and then everyone else is going to flock around you. And it says in verse 4, this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel, which that definitely bothers me because the elders of Israel were just listening to David. But maybe they realized that maybe they were all convicted that Absalom was the true king and that David really wasn't just. So we're going to see what happens tomorrow with this, because at this point, Absalom thinks it's good. The elders think it's good. It looks like they're going to kind of march through on this advice, and we're going to see what happens. All right, so if you're looking at me and not listening to me only, you are going to notice that this is a super weird edit. So this is the next day, and I noticed when I did my reading for today that I left out a portion of my reading from yesterday. So I ended it on 17:4, where it says that, I just did it. I'm really just attaching this in. Choosing 12,000 men and going out and attacking David. And I thought that was the end. Well, it's not the end. So what happens after that is that in verse 5, it says, Absalom says, summon Hushai the Hittite. Sorry, Hushai the Archite. And so he wanted to get his opinion as well. So now it was two counselors speaking to him and giving different opinions. And so he called this Hushai in. And he said, well, what do you think about that? And Hushai says, this is not a good plan, actually, that you shouldn't be doing that because you realize what an amazing warrior David is. And so it's a mistake to go out there and he's going to win. And then all the people are going to be like, oof, we're following Absalom, right? Should we be following Absalom because David won that? And so he says, so I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you and with you. So essentially he's saying, take some time, gather all the people together, get a bigger army, and then you can go out and do the attacking of David. So for right now, don't step out against him because remember, Ahithophel said, go out immediately. And he says, don't go out immediately. Take your time, gather your people in. And then verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So this is a really cool juxtaposition as well, because we see in up here in 1623, it says, now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of it. So it was advice similar to what that like one inquires of God. So, and then down here, it says the Lord determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So Ahithophel is inquiring of the Lord. The Lord is giving Ahithophel information, and then and he's sharing that information with Absalom. And then the Lord is like frustrating that information by, by giving him the wrong information in order to bring disaster on Absalom. And so the Lord is still working for David, although this is the time in David's life where there is calamity that is happening to him. And I know I keep saying calamity over and over again because it's really what we say, and it is what God has prophesied. And I also just want to follow up in this, for the Lord determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel. This is also one of the things that David prayed for. So David prayed for confusion in the advice that Ahithophel gives. And so that is how we're ending today. So it's slightly different than how I thought it was going to end. If you have been blessed by this video, I want you to hit the like button, the share button. Well, you can hit the share button and share it with somebody else, or just by word of mouth, share it with people. And then I want you to subscribe to the channel so it comes to you every day. And I want you guys to keep reading. See you tomorrow.